Hello everybody and welcome. My name's Clare Farrell and this is Dr. Charlie Gardner. We're recording this short conversation to follow on from the previous videos we've made together to look at the latest IPCC report. This is a synthesis report, which is the last one in a series that have come out. And importantly, this is the last update that we're going to get from this process before almost the end of this decade, right, Charlie? So tell us what this report is.
So the IPCC is a United Nations body that brings together all the latest climate science and tries to condense it all into a format that's available for governments and the media and others. And they have this big multi-year assessment cycle, which takes about 8 to 10 years. And every assessment cycle, they bring out a series of reports. And there are 4 reports every time. So there are 3 working groups, and we covered 2 of the working group reports in our previous videos. The 3 working groups talk about the climate science, then they talk about the impacts and how we adapt to that, and then the third one is how we mitigate it, how we avoid the worst impacts. So this is the synthesis report. It brings together those 3 reports, and as you say, it's really important because it's the first synthesis report since 2014, and it's the last one probably before 2030. And as we all know, all the changes that we always talk about and all the changes we need to make that this report outlines, we need to have made really strong progress with those by 2030. So, by the time the next report comes out, it's too late, essentially. If we haven't made big changes by then it will be too late to avoid the worst impact. So I know we've heard a lot, final warning from the IPCC, final warning. We hear this every time there's a new report, but this really does feel a bit like it. If governments don't take the action that this report is highlighting now, then by the time the next one's out, it'll be,
we'll be in the shit.
Bad times.
Okay. So we've got some notes here. Let's just look at some of the contents. Talk a bit about the differences between the reports, the summaries and the political pressure. So our notes here cover various things, but let's look at the language on fossil fuels. And can you explain to us what has actually happened in terms of the changes in language within these reports?
Sure. So it's really important to understand how these IPCC reports are produced, because what was released this week was the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report. Yeah. So it's just the headline statements really, but the full report is 6,000 pages and that hasn't been released yet. But it's important to think about how these reports are produced. So the full report, the 6,000 page report, is produced by scientists and it's just the scientific document. But the summary for policymakers has been agreed by governments. So it's not just a scientific document, it's a political document too. Yeah. And obviously, when you're condensing a 6,000 page report into a 36 page report, and that's all it is, the summary for policymakers is 36, then obviously you can't include everything. So there's big choices get made about what gets included and what doesn't. But there are also political arguments really about the way things are phrased. And quite often we see big changes between the drafts of the report and the final published version. Now we can't actually talk about what changes have been made to the report here because we don't have the full 6,000 page version yet, so we just don't know. But we can, if we look back at what happened with previous reports, the third working group report, for example, there was really good evidence of political pressure changing the wording of the summary for policymakers. So, for example, in the draft of the summary for policymakers for the third report, it referred to the need to actively phase out fossil fuels. And this draft was leaked by Scientist Rebellion, which is a sister movement to Extinction Rebellion. I'm also a member of Scientist Rebellion, and we leaked this report because we wanted there to be evidence of what it said before the political interference happened. Yeah. And it's a good job we did, because we can now see this process, how it works. So with regards to language on fossil fuels, which you mentioned, so the draft summary for policymakers talked about phasing out all fossil fuels, but because of political pressure from Saudi Arabia, the language in the final version was very different. Instead of phasing out fossil fuels, it talked about transitioning away from fossil fuels, but it said transitioning away from fossil fuels to lower carbon energy sources such as renewables and fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. And this is really dangerous, because instead of saying stop all fossil fuels like it did, it's saying we can continue fossil fuels if we capture the carbon from their emissions. So it's positioning fossil fuels as part of the solution, whereas we all know, and the science is very, very clear, that we have to stop using them entirely. And the other reason that's dangerous is that we don't actually have the technology to capture all the carbon from the emissions of these. So we're relying on really dangerous, unproven technologies. And we can talk about this a bit later, how it serves as an excuse to delay. Another example of this political interference is in the language over dietary change. So again, the leaked version of the summary talked about how in rich nations, in the minority world industrial societies, we need to shift to plant-based diets, and explicitly referred to plant-based diets. But then there was political pressure from Argentina and Brazil, which are both massive beef-producing, beef-exporting countries, and the language was completely changed. So now they talk about balanced, healthy diets instead of plant-based diets. So and meat and dairy just isn't mentioned anywhere in the report at all, although we know that production of meat and dairy contributes 15% of emissions. So I think, while this is a wonderful document and a hugely important document, we need to be aware that it can't say everything, because governments have to agree on it. And this is really important, because when we think of the real headline statements that this report puts out, all those statements have been agreed by every single government. So when we hear just really mind-boggling things, and we think, wow, that's really crazy, how can that be? Well, every government in the world has agreed that this is the case. There's no doubt about anything that's in these reports, which is great. We just have to be aware of what's not in them.
I mean, it's classic kind of meaningless language, isn't it? To say, okay, we're not going to say plant-based, we're going to say balanced, sustainable, healthy. I mean, it's everything about the sentence that they've chosen to replace the specifics with is open to any interpretation.
It's about obfuscation.
It's complete political game on that, isn't it? So then going on to the media, because obviously a lot of this stuff, lands in our media, which is quite good compared to a lot of other parts of the world. I know people who live in other countries where it doesn't even hit the news cycle, right? Nobody pays any attention. But the Mail famously have recorded this momentous report landing on page 19 below a massive story about a parking row, and the Telegraph saying it's confected hysteria. I mean, what do you think, and what do you think the scientific community thinks about the complete failure of the media to even try and communicate the seriousness? I mean, I feel like personally I'm in a sort of dystopian film, looking at this tiny bit here on page 19 of a right-wing rag that says, oh, by the way, it's nearly the end of the world, guys, but there's a granny having an argument about parking, so that's what we're going to talk about.
It's really shocking. How can this is not just the biggest news of the day, it's the biggest news that there has ever been or ever will be. This climate change we're undergoing, it changes everything, and it really should be headline news in every paper. It's quite dispiriting. I know exactly what you mean when it makes you feel like you're going mad. How can we know this stuff and people be doing so much to ignore it? It's not accidental that they do this. They always say, media organizations say, well, it's difficult to cover because it's not fast-moving news. It's just the continuation of the same story we've been hearing for years and years. And of course, there have been so many of these reports now that it doesn't feel like new news, and they use that as an excuse. But to be honest, I don't think it's because it's not newsworthy that they don't cover it. It's because it threatens their very business models. Pick up a newspaper and it will be full of adverts for cars and airplane trips and all these things which are based on high emissions, high carbon lifestyle. And it's that's where media organizations get their money. It's not from us buying the newspaper, it's from the advertisers that advertise in it.
So not to mention the billionaire owners who have shares in fossil fuel companies. Maybe that's also got something to do with it.
That is the case too, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to bring us on to this last warning messaging. So I know we spoke before about, the headline message says, last warning from the IPCC, rapidly closing window. It's like, act now or never kind of thing. Do you think that seeing this message again and again and again over multiple years is sort of not helpful or losing its edge or something? I don't.
It's certainly not breaking through at all. It's not persuading people to take action, and that's a real problem. I think it's problematic in several ways. For one, it helps feed into sort of denialist narratives a little bit. You hear it quite a lot. We've been hearing these doomsday warnings for 20 years now, and doomsday hasn't happened, so those warnings must have been incorrect. It's old news now. It's not exciting. It's not fresh. People are blasé about it, and that's a real problem. And I think we need to change the story, because this story isn't cutting through. The story that we need to change everything now or it will be too late. People just seem to have accepted that now. The problem with this story is that it makes us, it positions us as sort of passive bystanders. We're just powerless to do anything about that. And I think this IPCC report and the way they frame it feeds into that a lot, because all of this is about what governments have to do, and what we need to be doing at a societal level. But of course, that doesn't really mean anything to me as an individual, because I'm not the government. I can't press these levers. And what the report doesn't go on to talk about is what actually needs to happen to make the change. So it talks about the changes that are needed at a societal level. We need to fully decarbonize by 2050 and all this. It doesn't say how to make those changes happen. And of course, they've been saying the same thing for 30 years. The whole sort of idea that these reports are based on is, if the IPCC gathers together all the science, puts all the information in one place and gives it to governments, then governments will act on this information. But the evidence is there to see that that's not happening. They've had this information for a long, long time. Governments first agreed to address climate change in 1992 at the Earth Summit. I was 13 years old, for fuck's sake. It was a long time ago. And clearly, just having the information hasn't worked, because this isn't about information at the end of the day. It's about power and influence. And although we know that millions of people and millions of non-human species will suffer because of it, the fact is that a very small number of people are doing quite well out of it, doing quite well of the way the world works right now. And they don't want this change. So they have invested hugely in delaying this transition that we need to embark on as a society. It says right in the second paragraph of this report, it says emissions are still rising. And I think that's like the key sentence in the whole thing. Despite having been talking about this for 30 years, emissions are still rising. And to me, that points to a very obvious conclusion that just producing more of these reports isn't going to work. Producing these reports hasn't worked so far. It's not going to work because providing information doesn't counter the power and influence of those that don't want us to transition. So I think this is what's really missing, and this is why we need to develop new stories. Rather than focusing on the same old, it's 5 seconds to midnight, we have to act now. We need to focus on how to empower people to actually take action, actually do something about this, rather than sitting back and waiting for our governments to do it when they clearly are not interested in doing that.
Yeah. Well, and it relates to the recent announcement by all those lawyers, right? Lawyers are responsible, just put out a statement. Their embargo was broken, by the way, by the Daily Mail, who put them on the front page. It's a good sign that you're doing the right type of campaigning, in my opinion. But they, got a lot of media about that recently. And one person who's signatory, Paul Powsland, was trying to explain on this interview, if you're very rich, like Shell, then you can spend hundreds of thousands of pounds with a city law firm to put injunctions around your property to make it so that anybody who goes onto your forecourts of your petrol stations, for example, who might be holding a sign, is then in breach of an injunction, which is a private legal arrangement, which then puts that person in breach of a court order, which means they've done contempt of court, which means that they can get direct route into a 2-year prison sentence. And the reason that that can happen to a person protesting against Shell is basically because Shell are very rich. And ordinary people could never afford to do that kind of thing. So I thought that was a really helpful example for people to understand, aside from the greenwashing, the advertising, the PR, the spin, the misinformation, all of that we know about with fossil fuel sector, the continuation of their power and privilege being able to be like weaponized against, a peaceful movement to try and do the right thing. There's a massive power imbalance that is basically fueled by them being so phenomenally rich, isn't it?
It feels like, that they're really starting to panic, the fossil fuel industries. They've used their power very successfully for a long, long time to convince society first that it wasn't happening, and then that it is happening, but it's not the fault of fossil fuels, and now that it is happening, it is the fault of fossil fuels, but it's not something we need to worry about. We can just continue chilling out. That strategy has started to fail over the last few years as we've seen the rise of climate justice movements and social movements all over the world. People have seen through their bullshit and are rising up. But what's interesting now is that they seem to be panicking and investing in lots of other ways to express their power beyond just disinformation. Yeah. And what's interesting as well is that the disinformation, the outright denialism, is making a comeback. Like, that seems to have disappeared for a while. Nobody was actually saying that this is not happening or that it's overblown, but it seems to be making a real comeback now. Like, you pointed out that article in the Telegraph saying this is what was the word? It was
confected hysteria.
Confected hysteria. That is outright climate denialism, and it's making a comeback. And the reason it is, I think, is because of the power of our social movements. They're running scared that people are starting to find fossil fuels unacceptable. They're losing their social license to operate, and they're getting desperate, and so they're investing again in this outright climate denialism.
Baked into this report is that there's massively underreported impact of the cooling effect of aerosols in our Earth's atmosphere, and it gives a potential impact window for those in terms of the fact that they're reducing how much heating we're actually experiencing. Can you just explain what that means?
Yeah, so when we burn something, be it fossil fuel or even wood, we give off carbon dioxide, we give off greenhouse gases, which obviously warm us up, but we also give off tiny particles of aerosols, like things like soot, and these actually have a cooling effect. Particles of soot in the atmosphere, they reflect heat back, so they keep us cool. And what this report says right at the beginning, we've reached 1.1 degree over pre-industrial levels, but it says that 1.1 degree is the outcome of both warming and cooling factors. So just from the greenhouse gases that we've released, it might have reached 2 degrees, but because we've also released these aerosols, then that's had a cooling effect of up to 0.8. So the result is it's only been 1.1. So of course we know that we need to decarbonize, move on to cleaner energy sources as quickly as we can. That's really, really important. But there's a risk that as we stop burning stuff, we'll also be releasing fewer of these aerosols. So this masking effect that the aerosols have is going to get thinner. And this isn't something we talk about very often. Even lots of climate scientists aren't always very aware of this masking effect, and I just think it's something that we have to be more aware of. Of course, it doesn't mean we need to slow decarbonisation or anything like that, but we do need to be aware that there will be this unintended side effect of decarbonisation, which is reducing these aerosols.
I mean, my experience when you try and get people to talk about it is that a lot of experts, scientists, whatever, you say, oh, what about this? And they go, oh, don't worry yourself about that, dear, because we just don't know that it's not very good data, let's move on. It's like, what we definitely know is bad enough, thanks, and all that patronising. It's really, I find it very problematic, the kind of attitude that you sometimes get from this space, where as a lay person looking at scientific information, I can see that what that means is if you're taking like a risk-aware approach, you'd say, okay, we're at 1.1, but the chances are we're actually at 2, but we're not feeling it. So when we decarbonise, we're working from today from 2 onwards, right? Let's just take it as that, because it could be. So if it could be that, we should act like it is that, right? Absolutely. Because it's a high-risk scenario that we're in.
Absolutely. And don't forget, of course, this attitude, we don't have precise enough data, so let's just wait and see. That's the same attitude that's seen us get so far into this problematic place where we are now. That's how people have approached climate change for so long. Yeah, we've known it was happening, but people have been like, oh, well, we don't know exactly how much is happening, so let's just forget all about it. I mean, what sort of ridiculous attitude to risk is that? Not having precision is no excuse for ignoring something. It's in fact, there should be even more of a reason to focus on it until you have more information, shouldn't it?
Yeah, totally. It's really complicated though. I do worry about it from a comms perspective, because it's like, how are you going to get the public and the media to understand that just when they've finally accepted that carbon emissions cause heating, that if you take them down really quickly, it gets hotter quicker. I think it's, we've got such a major problem with the lack of literacy in the media, for example, to be able to talk about this stuff. Okay, so then similar sort of part of the conversation is on overshoot. And I think we touched on this last time, but like, what are they on about, saying that we can like temporarily overshoot and then somehow like pull back down? That doesn't sound really that feasible to me, but it's been quite a focus, hasn't it, of this stuff? So what does that mean? To
be honest, it really, really worries me. There's this whole section, one of the 18 sections in this report, is focused just on this idea of overshoot. Up till now, the whole time, it's all been about avoiding reaching 1.5 degrees. That's always been our target, but we've left it so long that there's very little chance of not hitting 1.5 degrees now, and it makes that clear in this report. But there's this one section where it says, actually, reaching 1.5 needn't be the end of the world, because as we develop new carbon removal technologies to suck greenhouse gases back out the air again, we can bring it back down below 1.5. And so it says that we might blow past 1.5 by at least 0.1 degree, but it's not a problem because we can get it down again below the end of the century. So I just find this idea really terrifying, and they sort of refer to it themselves there. There's this sentence which says, the problem with this is that we might make lots of irreversible changes when we go past 1.5. Yeah. And this is one of the big issues that lots of people have with the whole report, actually, is that it doesn't deal enough with what we call feedback loops. So it just talks about the impacts of emissions, but it doesn't talk about other things that might happen as we get warmer. So there's a few very well-known examples of that. I'm sure most people have heard of the albedo effect. As it warms, all the sea ice melts, and then you have this lovely white surface that was reflecting lots of light and heat back, and now it's a dark blue ocean surface which absorbs it. Another very obvious feedback effect is with wildfires. Like, nature stores vast amounts of carbon, and we need to preserve our nature to continue sequestering some of our emissions. But as we've seen in recent years, as it's got warmer, it's just lots of forests and other wild places around the world are just burning because they can't stand the heat anymore, and that releases lots more carbon dioxide. So the IPCC say, all right, we can get past 1.5 and come back down again. But what happens if, as you approach 1.5, that leads to lots of sea ice melt, lots of forest burning, lots of methane released from the permafrost?
Well, it's an amazing
might mean you
list.
can't get back down again.
It's a staggering list that on overshoot, they then say, causing additional warming via feedback, increased wildfires, mass mortality of trees, drying peatlands, permafrost thawing, weakening natural land carbon sinks, and increasing the release of greenhouse gases. It's like, it doesn't seem acceptable to me to write in an official report, would make the return more challenging. I mean, I just don't understand how that many complex interacting feedbacks can possibly leave you any room to say that the return could be more challenging. I mean, it feels problematic to me that there's a sort of overshoot fairy tale that's almost sort of built on the back of the unicorn technology fairy tale. It's magical thinking. It's absolutely magical thinking. There's so much resistance to making the hard decisions that need to be made now that people are prepared to believe in magic instead of having to face the difficult decisions to be made now. And having this this overshoot idea integrated into the report, it gives it a legitimacy which it doesn't deserve. And this is as a result of political pressure from the fossil fuel industry and from governments who lobby on behalf of the fossil fuel industries that have captured them. And I think it's we really need to fight against this idea of overshooting being an acceptable or viable pathway. We cannot overshoot and come back. We need to do absolutely everything we can to not reach 1.5. And that means, stopping burning fossil fuels and stopping destroying nature now. It feels like sometimes you can be caught between these two sort of camps in a way, where on the one hand you have to say, let's be hopeful, we've got this, we can still do this, even though the evidence is really saying 1.5 is off the table given this sort of political, social reality, the physical science that we're looking at and all of the data. But on the other hand, if you do go around saying like, oh, things are going to collapse, we're going to breach 1.5 really soon, probably 2 looks really hard to attain, you're then put in this sort of doomism. You're a bad person, you're making everything worse, you're stopping people from acting because they're so unhappy, so miserable, people are suffering mental health crisis and everything. So in terms of the public discourse, you're sort of stuck between two main camps. One is magical thinking and like, we have to retain some optimism, otherwise you're a bad person. And the other one is, oh, it's hysterical, what are you on about? Yeah, it sounds bad, but they're just experts, so fuck it. Okay, so let's put this visual up with the possible futures and how they think it's going to impact different generations.
So I really like this image they've put together to illustrate the different possible futures that we have depending on the decisions we make now. They use the climate stripes, which represent the temperature anomaly each year with a colour. So the red years are warmer than the average, blue years are colder than the average. And we can see up till now, that things have been getting hotter and hotter and hotter. But from 2020 onwards, we have these 5 different pathways ranging from very, very high emissions to very, very low emissions. And we can see that the decisions made now will have huge impacts on what the temperature is moving forward. But the thing I really like about this picture is that, you know, when we talk about 2050, 2070, 2100, these are abstract numbers that we can't get our heads around. We don't think about the real human lives that will be impacted by this. And by adding people to this figure, we not only see the, the impact on real people, but we can also see how different the impact is in different generations. We see that someone born in 1930, is reaching the end of their life now, whereas someone born today is going to be reaching the end of their life in, at the end of the century. And it viscerally makes clear that we don't all have the same stake in this. When you see it expressed like that, it just seems so wrong that someone who's 70 now is able to vote for a government that is making decisions about the future, and yet someone who's 16 is not. Yeah. And yet one of those people has a stake in that future that's been determined and the other one doesn't. It doesn't specifically talk about intergenerational equity in this document, but this image makes it very clear how much this idea underlies everything we should be doing.
Some people who study democracy recently told me that something along these lines, I might not be totally accurate, but that there's a cognitive capacity of people who are over 80, which is obviously quite old, which on average becomes something that you could equate to the average 12-year-old. And so when a group of school children asked me the other day, we've got no voice, what should we do? I said, you should campaign for 12-year-olds and up vote, because I know from doing this work that you need to put out a campaign message that is audacious. You have to push beyond where you think you need to go. And as you say, the truth is, young people have got an enormous stake in the political reality of today, far more than the older people. I thought that would spark that intergenerational debate in a really helpful way. Let's move on then. Loss and damage. Having loss and damage in the scientific kind of reports and more prominent in these, things that come out with the policy and the political sort of mashup. What does it mean to have so much mention of loss and damage?
Well, it's really, really important from the point of view of climate justice, I think. In recent years, there's been a growing movement within the global political process, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which the Paris Agreement is part of, to build in mechanisms for loss and damage whereby rich countries like ours that industrialized and got rich off the back of unlimited fossil fuel use are responsible, directly responsible for the suffering and the death and the destruction that is happening in the majority world, in the global south. So campaigners and governments from the global south are pushing for a mechanism in the convention so that rich countries can pay for the damage they've caused. Now, this report, while it's separate from the political process, it states time and time again throughout the evidence of culpability. Like, it makes clear in several places that the major contribution historically has come from rich countries. It makes clear in several other places that people primarily paying the costs are poor countries who are suffering the loss of damage. They're more vulnerable to impacts, and they're suffering more impacts just by accident of geography. So by making all these facts clear, this report makes it clear that it's the rich countries who are to blame, and that it's countries in the global south who are primarily suffering. And by using these words, losses and damages, which they use throughout, I think it really greatly strengthens the case for loss and damage negotiations in the political process. And I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, and this is the first time it's ever been in the synthesis report, right? This kind of level of discussion on loss and damage. One question is, what's being done and what's needed?
One of the problems with this report is that it's really, really focused on emissions. It's not focused on the things that cause the emissions. And when you think about how you address problems, generally it's best to address them at the beginning, at an early stage, rather than the end. And emissions are what happens at the end of the pipe. Producing fossil fuels is what happens at the start of the pipe. It's quite clear about what needs to happen with emissions, which is that they need to be rapidly brought down at an unprecedented scale. Essentially, we need to halve them by 2030 at a global level, and then reach zero or net zero by the early 2050s. It also actually does cover a lot of good news. It shows how we have made some progress to date. It says that policies that countries have implemented have had an effect. Like we have, climate action so far has avoided some emissions, and we're not emitting as much as we would have done had we not had climate action. So there is some good news. But the report really starkly highlights how the things that governments are doing now just aren't going to be enough, and they're not going to be enough in two key ways. The way the Paris Agreement expects countries to make actions is that individual countries will make pledges. They'll say, this is how much we're going to decarbonize. Those pledges are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. In this report, they add up all the pledges that all the different countries have made, and they find that those pledges just aren't strong enough. If every country was to meet those pledges, then that would lead to something like, I think it was 2.7 or 2.8 degrees of heating. So the promises countries are made are not enough. An even bigger problem than that is that they're just empty promises.
Like, they're not doing it.
They're not doing it. So you're not putting in place policies that will allow them to meet those pledges. And UK is a great example. We were the first industrialized country in the world to set a legally binding decarbonisation target for 2050. And then we celebrated. We were like, yeah, we're the first to have a target, job done, right? But all the actual policies that that govern what happens in this country haven't been changed to allow us to meet that. Famously, we've approved a new coal mine, and there are hundreds of new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. But beyond that, we're planning to expand airports. We're still building new roads. We're still building new houses to really bad standards that are going to have to be immediately retrofitted if we're going to decarbonise. So, what's the point of having a 2050 target if all your actual policies are taking you in the wrong direction? It's not like the policies are taking us in the right direction, but too slow. They're taking us in the wrong direction. New oil licenses is the wrong direction. New roads and airport expansion, it's the wrong direction. So this is hugely problematic. And there was this really stark sentence just buried in a paragraph in the middle of the report. It said, without a strengthening of policies, global warming of 3.2 degrees is projected by 2100. As things stand, we can expect to see global warming of 3.2 degrees by 2100. Now, there's two very key things to think about here. One is that we have no clue what a 3.2 degree world would be like, but there is absolutely no evidence, there is no suggestion at all that organised human society could exist in a 3 degree world. Our societies are so complex and interdependent that there's lots of very, very serious people just don't see how something so complex could survive such rapid changes. So, and we're talking about the risk of collapse of civilization, the end of organized human society by 2100. And this report is saying that could happen. Well, it's not saying that we could get collapse, but it's saying we could get 3 degrees. And at 3 degrees, a lot of people say will get collapsed. The other thing that's really important to always, always, always remember when we're talking about 3 degrees by 2100 is that people already born today should, all other things being equal, should still be alive in 2100. And like, we're not talking about theoretical people. We're talking about my nephews and nieces. They should be alive to. It's just, yeah, it's just extraordinary that after everything.
So just as they're not in these things saying what should be done, i.e. find a way to force the action to happen against perhaps the will of the finance sector to say we'd quite like to still make money out of this, is also true, isn't it, that it's not telling anyone in simple language what things really mean, right? Because if you bury in the middle of a report something that says, you know, basically it's going to hit 3.2 degrees, and let's remember that we just said it could have 0.8 baked in as like a masking effect, so that already takes you over to 4. With all that in mind, the question does come, doesn't it? Should this report actually include the word collapse?
I think the reason it doesn't is because they could never get every nation to include that. Personally, yeah, I think it should. You know,
if it was being honest.
Yeah, well, that's it. If it was being honest, scientists like to talk about the facts or the predictions. They don't like to talk about the implications of those facts or the implications of those predictions. It also comes partly down to how we treat different kinds of information. So, yeah, we tend to have more faith in quantitative information than qualitative information. And so, you know,
can you explain what you mean by that? Because
so
it's quite academic.
Numbers.
Yeah.
Things that you can do a calculation of rather than things which you can just describe. So when we're talking about a 3 degree world, you know, you can have complex computer models that say we'll reach 3 degree world with this much emissions. And you know, that feels like really, really solid knowledge because a computer model generated it. So we're happy to put that in the report. This is solid. But when you think about what might happen in a 3 degree world, that's far too complex to model. You can't do computer models with that because that's all about human decisions. And, you know, we can't predict how societies will react. You know, most places you don't even know who's going to win the next general election. Like how, if you can't even predict that, how are you going to predict how people are going to react in a 3 degree world? So you can't model these things. You can't do it with numbers. You can only, you know, imagine different scenarios. And because those are just verbal descriptions of what might happen, they feel like a less formal, a less solid form of knowledge than a computer that generates numbers. There's a new branch of social science called collapsology. It's a whole new research area, but because it's new and scary and doesn't have quantifiable numbers, I think it just doesn't make it into reports like these to the same extent.
There's also a question on my mind when you're saying that, the sense of conviction that people have in something like a computer model, which I know some people who've been involved in climate modelling for a long time who've said actually they're not that accurate. I wouldn't bet my child's life on them personally. You know, there's another way, isn't there, to find out information about climate by looking at the history of our climate, and they call that paleo data. In fact, one of the scientists who discovered it has just passed away, Claude, I forget his surname, a French guy, who famously dug out ice from the Arctic and dropped it in his whiskey and then noticed the gas coming out. So then that's how he kind of discovered that if you drill down into ice and you pull bits out, you can go, oh, this ice is this old, and then I can measure what gases were in the atmosphere. So we have quite a lot of data in that direction, don't we, as well? And that's quite, some people feel that's very solid. Is that involved in the IPCC process, much of that?
I don't think it is to the extent that it should be. Climate science is actually a lot more complex than people often think. If you're reading the IPCC report, you could be sort of led to think that the only factor that will determine future temperature is the amount of emissions. But actually there are three separate things. One is the amount of emissions. One is what you were just starting to refer to, which is climate sensitivity, which is for any given amount of emissions, how much will temperature rise? I'll come back to that in a second. And then the third one is about the carbon cycle and feedback loops, that, like we were talking before with forest fires and stuff. And climate sensitivity is a real, a hot issue and quite controversial amongst climate scientists, because the IPCC models assume a certain level of sensitivity, like for X amount of atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, you get Y amount of heating. But James Hansen, perhaps the most famous climate scientist in the world, it was James Hansen that famously presented data to Congress in the USA in 1988 when he was at NASA. He's recently published a paper saying that based on paleoclimate data, sensitivity might be much, much higher than we thought. So instead of getting Y amount of heating for the concentrations we got, we get a lot more heating than that at these concentrations, which suggests that we're just in the middle of a time lag, that even if we didn't emit lots more, it would carry on getting hotter as the planet caught up. This IPCC report, or I think the IPCC in general, I think doesn't pay enough attention to the risks of different climate sensitivities.
I got that Hansen email to the mailing list that said something like, "Oh, could go up to 9 degrees."
Yeah, 10 was the figure I had in my mind.
And or something like that. And then I got really curious about, like, how are we going to find out that information? So when that lands, maybe we should have a look at it, because I know it's gone out for, like, peer review or whatever, but it feels to me like, that's not new news, is it? That's like he's had that thinking in his work for a very long time. Obviously, we all know that there are, like, in quote, benefits of near and long-term action, but there's a chart here that you're going to show. So do you want to explain in broad terms what they are?
So the report is very, very clear that acting immediately, as quick as we can, is hugely important and will give benefits, not just with regards to climate change. It'll also have benefits in terms of improved human health and reductions on poverty and things. But in terms of our action on climate change, the faster we act, the better, because not only will that reduce the severity of the bad impacts we're already experiencing and will experience in future, it also makes it much less likely that we'll suffer the worst outcomes. The more we delay, the more likely it is that the very, very worst outcomes, like collapse or human extinction, the more likely they are, the longer we delay. The easier it will be and the less expensive it will be to adapt. Impacts mean we have to change everything. If when it gets too hot to grow food, you need to develop new ways of growing food or grow new crops or whatever. So adaptation is difficult, and adaptation's not proven, and adaptation is expensive. But the earlier we act, the easier it will be to adapt, the cheaper it will be to adapt, and the more adaptation options we'll have. So acting now is ultimately it's about keeping our options open rather than closing them off. The sooner we act, the less climate change will destroy the natural world, which is our life support system, our safety net. So taking action now means that nature is going to be in a better state to provide that safety net for us later. So for all sorts of reasons, it is not just it's not just common sense that it makes sense to act as soon as possible. The economics are very, very clear that it's cheaper to act as soon as possible too.
And going back to nature, one of the main sort of things that we could do that's highly effective, as shown by this chart, is conserve natural environments, protect things that are being destroyed. It's better to keep a tree than plant a tree. right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this brilliant graph here showing all the contributions that different approaches, different things we could do can make to mitigating. The biggest potential comes from solar energy. But what's really, really interesting, as you say, is the second biggest potential comes from conserving wild places, stopping destroying nature. Like when we think of decarbonisation, we always tend to think of technological solutions because that's what we hear. We think of solar and wind or whatever, but actually nature can do a big part of the job for us if we just stop destroying it. It also shows that there's lots of potential for soils. So it's not just vegetation that stores carbon, our soils do too. And they show that if we were to reform our agriculture, so not just moving away from producing animal products towards plant-based food products, but also if we change the way we produce plants, do it in a more regenerative way, then we could sequester huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere into the soils, and that has huge potential. As you say, this chart also shows that it's much, much more important to conserve the existing forests and trees we have rather than planting new ones. And this is important because, planting new trees is always talked about as a solution to climate change. And the reason that is, it's really easy. It's much easier to plant a tree than to decarbonize your company. So people like to do this. It's nice and visible. You get a photo opportunity with your spade and a community member. As good as planting trees is, it's not a solution because it doesn't address the main thing that needs to be done, which is stopping fossil fuels. But what this chart shows very, very clearly is there's much less value in planting a tree compared to conserving a tree that already exists. And that's obvious. When you plant a sapling, it's going to take 50 years or 100 years before that's a mature tree providing, storing lots of carbon and providing a home for biodiversity and things. You can't replace a forest with a plantation of saplings, and we need to stop thinking about things as just, planting 10 trees is going to solve all our problems. Ultimately, we need to stop fossil fuels. There's a couple of other interesting things in this chart here as well. There's a big lobby for nuclear power, and people often talk about nuclear power as being a big part of the solution. Well, this very clearly shows that nuclear power has much, much less potential than solar and wind, so there's really no need to focus on nuclear. It also has this little section on, it shows a bar for bioelectricity. This is the idea that, we can grow crops or we can harvest wild trees and burn them for energy, and then capture the emissions from that. And this is supposed to be sustainable because, yes, a tree gives off emissions when you burn it, but when you plant a new tree, that will suck those emissions back in again. What this shows is that actually burning trees has a lot less potential than not burning trees, than conserving intact ecosystems. So this idea that we can chop down forests to burn them for electricity, and that is somehow a climate solution, this is nonsense. And this is particularly relevant for us in the UK because our largest power station, Drax Power Station, is burning trees for electricity. And it's not even burning trees that were specifically planted for the purpose. It's deforesting old growth native forests in South Carolina and Canada and Estonia. It's absolutely scandalous that we're burning forests for energy, and this makes that very clear.
If anyone hasn't seen it, they should definitely go and look up the documentary, about Drax Power Station burning old growth forest from Canada. It's completely mind-blowingly shocking. What people should also do with this knowledge is they should go and climb up trees and protect them, and stay there. And if they can't climb up a tree and protect it, they should go and support people that do that, because it's a really important piece of our heritage and our lineage in our sort of UK-based, conservation and protest movements.
Just so we're clear, that's absolutely worth doing just from emissions, just from a climate change point of view, purely for the carbon stored in trees. But don't forget, trees are a lot more than just the carbon they store. They are communities. They're homes for communities of plants and animals, and they do lots of wonderful things for us too. You know, they help prevent flooding. They bring huge joy to our lives. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons to conserve nature beyond just for climate change. But this report makes it very clear that conserving nature is a key part of getting out of this climate emergency.
So moving from trees to the economy, there's like a really beautiful analogy that I've seen people make, looking at the value of a tree in our economic system. A tree which is like home to thousands of forms of life, that has existed over possibly quite a lot of generations, has given oxygen, has taken in carbon, has helped the soil. All of that is totally worthless. The only way that it has any material, real value in our society is if you chop it down, you turn it into 2x4 and you flog it for as competitive a rate as you can get. And mostly that's going to go and get made into some kind of product that has a short life expectancy and then ends up in a tip, right? So we have this economic system that only can recognise value in the natural world when it's like severely like simplified and then churned through something which is like turns it into waste really, really quickly. So with all of that in mind, and looking at the information that we've got in front of us, it does seem that the economic models that we live with are completely incompatible with reckoning with this situation. And it feels like it is far more mainstream now as a result of these reports for people to be going, well, hang on a minute, perhaps, surprise, surprise, a perpetual growth-based economy is not going to be able to make a serious response to the climate crisis in the way that we need to. And does this chart help us to think about that? And what are your thoughts?
I think it really does. So a lot of sort of mainstream economists like to say that climate change and the destruction of nature are not, they don't mean that we have to transition away from our growth-based system, because as technology develops, we'll be able to decouple economic growth from its environmental impacts. So this idea of green growth is basically that we can continue growing the economy, but we'll just find ways to have less impacts as we do that, so we can continue growing forever. But when you look at these charts, the red line across the top is the prediction for what will happen if we carry on with the levels of action we have now. But in order to reach 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we will have to follow the trajectory on this blue line or this green line. Just looking at them, I just don't see how those rapid declines can be compatible with the idea of green growth. I don't see how a growing economy can contract its emissions that fast. This is saying our emissions have to fall off a cliff, essentially.
Yeah, it's mad. It's like everything's going up, or at least it's going flat, and it has to just go down, right?
Just from a common sense perspective, just looking at it visually, obviously if you continue to try and promote growth, if growth is what you're going for, then I don't see how you're going to get this level of emissions. I think we really need to start looking at alternative economic models, start looking at steady state economies where they're not continually growing, or even degrowth, which is the planned contraction of the economy, where you think very seriously about which aspects of the economy we still need and which aspects we don't, and you consciously degrow those parts of the economy. A child can see that perpetual growth on a finite system is not possible. Ultimately, our economy is not going to continue growing forever, and I don't think it's even going to continue growing for very long. Our choice is whether we let our economy contract in an unplanned way when we cross geophysical boundaries and the planetary system just doesn't allow us to grow the economy anymore, or we do it in advance of reaching these catastrophic impacts, plan it and do it in a sensible, well-planned way. And I think, you know, it's a no-brainer, really. But just one more point on this chart. You pointed out how steep the decline of that slope is. It's worth remembering that that slope is only this steep because we've delayed and delayed and delayed. We've listened to the people saying that we don't need to take serious action. Had we started declining our emissions properly 30 years ago when we first agreed to do it, it wouldn't be an emergency now. We'd have been able to make small, incremental, easy steps across this 30 years, and we'd have half solved the problem now. It's because we listened to people saying we don't act. It's because we let these delayers get the upper hand that we're in such an emergency situation now. Obviously, the absolute last thing we should do is continue listening to those delayers. It was listening to them that got us into this trouble in the first place.
Yeah, and it's very instructive, this, isn't it? It says 2019 emissions were 12% higher than 2010. There wasn't exactly a lack of information around at that time. So let's go to the sort of closing part of our conversation. What do you think is actually missing?
This is a really, really important question, because this report, you know, as we talked about earlier, this report just says governments need to do X, Y, and Z. But governments have demonstrated time and time and time again, ever since the first report, that they are not prepared to do X, Y, and Z. They are still actively promoting the continuation of the fossil fuel era when they should be shutting it down. You know, somewhere in this report, it makes it very clear that there is still more finance flowing to new fossil fuels than there is to climate mitigation and adaptation. So the report is saying governments need to do X, Y, and Z. Governments have said for the last 30 years, no, we're not going to do that. You know, or they've, not quite, they've said we'll do that, but meanwhile they're just continuing.
That's how politicians say they're not going to do something, isn't it? They say they will do it and then they don't do it.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. So it seems to me we need to start thinking a bit more deeply about this. You know, simply giving the information to our governments is not enough, because, you know, we go to them with graphs and data, or the IPCC go to them with graphs and data, but fossil fuel companies are going to them with giant buckets of cash, and of course, who are they going to listen to?
Yeah.
For me, the key question, as you've pointed out, you know, what are the implications for us, the people of Earth that don't happen to be members of governments? And it's really important that we do something, and that we take what power we have to try and make this shift. Not only because I think people power is the only way we're going to get out of this, but also on an individual level, it's really, really important to feel like there's something you can do, to feel like you can have an influence. There was some really interesting psychological work that was published on a survey with young people, published a couple of years ago. And it found, obviously the headline finding was that young people are suffering really bad mental health impacts from climate anxiety. But when they looked at why these people are suffering from climate anxiety, one was a sense of betrayal. They feel like they've just been fucked over by earlier generations. But the other one was that they don't feel there's anything they can do about it. They lack a sense of agency. And so they're stressing, not just because bad things are coming, but because they don't feel they can do anything about it. And this report, I think, misses out on a real opportunity by not also considering what can happen, what needs to be done from a grassroots level. This report is all about from top down governance. But since governments have made it clear they're not going to do that, the conclusion is obvious to me, and that we have to force them to do so. So there's a lot of really, really interesting social science research coming out now, talking about, you know, how we're going to get out of this, and they all seem to converge on this same idea, which is this idea of social tipping points. Change will happen when there are so many people resisting the destruction, when there are so many people demanding change, and when there are so many people making change themselves, that change becomes inevitable. And for me, what that shows is that there's a really, really important role for everyone. You know, for me, climate action is about building momentum, trying to get this snowball rolling and growing until we reach these social tipping points where our power as citizens is, you know, greater than the power of the fossil fuel and other destructive industries. If our end goal is social tipping points, and the way we reach there is by building momentum, that means that every single person has a critical role to play by taking action, because the way we reach social tipping points is through social contagion. And this is how our societies work. Yeah, our ideas and our behavior spreads. Imagine yourself at a party or a concert where there's good music, you've had a couple of drinks, but no one's dancing. So at first, dancing is climate action, by the way, in case this analogy is a bit complex. So at first, you don't want to dance, right? You're getting into music, you're starting to nod, but there's no way you're going to step up and be the first person to do it. But then someone does get up and you're a bit more tempted, but they're a bit weird and you don't want to, you know, get up and be dancing with this weird person. But then eventually a couple of people do get up and dance, and they validate that first dancer, and that seems to open a floodgates, and lots of people start dancing, and you feel liberated by safety in numbers, so you get up and join them. But then a really amazing thing can happen. If the atmosphere is really good and the music's good, so many people can start dancing that it reaches a tipping point where the people that didn't want to dance, stood at the back of the room, they start feeling left out. Now they feel like the weird ones because they're not dancing. At first, when no one was dancing was weird and not acceptable. Then dancing became accepted. But once it reaches that tipping point, it becomes expected and everyone gets drawn in because our behaviors are contagious. Yeah. So when we take action as individuals, that action spreads through social contagion. And of course, I don't just mean taking action by, going plant-based and all the things we can do to address our own footprint, although that is important. But, when I think of climate action, I think of much more holistically. So having a conversation about climate, speaking to the bloke in the shops about why you bought a plant-based burger, or speaking to your grandmother about why you're worried, having that conversation, going beyond your comfort zone to have that conversation, is climate action. If you push for change at school, or if you push for change at work or in your football team, that is climate action. And of course, campaigning and activism is the most powerful form of climate action of all, which is why we do it, But with all of these things, we tend to think of, just the direct impact of my choices. If I have a plant-based burger instead of a beef burger, then that's 2 kilos of carbon dioxide or whatever not emitted, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's not the direct impact that counts. It's not the emissions you've avoided, it's the power of what you've done to inspire other people. And I really think that is how we're going to get out of this. Our only hope is to reach these social tipping points where so many people are demanding change that it becomes inevitable. And the way we get there is by each of us visibly doing what we can. This is what's frustrating about the IPCC report. We talked about how people tend to have more faith in quantitative science, where you can put a number on it. The social science of how we achieve massive social change, it's not quantitative. You can't put numbers on it. And I think there's a real gap here. This report hasn't sufficiently taken on board the social science. It just talks about what change needs to happen. It hasn't included the social science of how that change happens. How do individuals make that change happen? And of course, these are the most important questions of all, but they're not here in the IPCC report. Well,
and you might say that given the quality of the work, it would actually be really shit if this report was trying to tell us how to make social change, because they might get it wrong.
You're
right?
not wrong.
Like,
yeah.
it's a complicated affair. And I know, you know, this thing, oh, it's just a matter of political will. I've had plenty of conversations with people where they say that. So what I think we never talk about is what is this weird thing that everyone says is political will, because I don't know people that actually know what that means. And when you examine the systemic problems with our political system, for example, you know, if you had the, in quotes, political will to fix climate or to deal with it, you would not win an election. Like, everybody knows that, like, a proper policy to deal with this situation, or a suite of policies to deal with it, just won't win in the current situation. So in terms of using social movements and Extinction Rebellion and other social movements that are working towards getting this change to happen, isn't it important to recognise that the power differential that we're up against, the power of the lobbying, the power of vested interest, the power of the media, the money, the, you know, dodgy deals with politicians, the power differential seems to me that we need as many people as possible to understand that kind of age-old concept, right? Which is that, isn't it extraordinary that so many people are on the one side of something, calling for a better world or for a livable future, whatever this message is, and they're up against really such a very small number of people, right? So the bigger numbers of people is the punt that Extinction Rebellion has been taking, to say, okay, let's try and widen the invite, let's get the movement to be much, much bigger this year, let's get as many people as humanly possible out on the streets, beginning with this thing in April. So in terms of that, what do you want to say to scientists and to our movement about continuing this work in terms of building up numbers, boots on the ground, people who show up, embodied struggle, embodied resistance, positivity around that?
Well, I think, you know, given what we know about how ideas spread and about this idea of social contagion, I think, you know, it's hugely important that everybody does do what they can and does get out on the streets and does try and you know, manifest their power to whatever extent they can, because it inspires others to do so. And I've got first-hand experience of that. You know, I wasn't a member of Extinction Rebellion at the beginning, but in 2018, you know, I went online one day and then suddenly there was XR on bridges, and I thought, finally somebody is treating this as urgently as it needs to be treated. And it inspired me, it enabled me to feel that that was something I could do too. I never would have thought of, you know, trying to actively resist my government in this way until somebody showed me that it could be done, and then that inspired me to do it. Now we're in a situation where everybody knows about XR, but most people know about XR through the lens of the mass media, who have tried to portray activists as, you know, bad people and not like you and disruptive and the problem. When we, you know, are part of XR and we're you know, we take part in actions, then all the people we know, all the people we talk to about this get a different perspective. They see that actually we're not just troublemakers, we're just normal people who care, and that can be really, really inspiring to others. So I think taking the step, going beyond your comfort zone, and, you know, joining a group, being part of a social movement is hugely important. So when we get out on the streets, it demonstrates that we are treating this like the emergency it is, and I think that's really powerful. But you pointed to something else there as well. You pointed out the power inequalities that exist between the 99% of humanity that will do nothing but lose out of climate change, and the 1% or whatever that gain from the status quo. And you're right that the way to counter that is with numbers, to build a counter movement of so many people that we become powerful. But I think there's part of it also is about our approach as as activists. For most of the history of the climate movement, our approach has been about asking our leaders to do something, saying, yeah, please act. But that's not working. What we've seen over recent years is quite an evolution in the climate movement from asking power to do something to actively resisting that power. And I think that's important too. To think strategically about the power we're confronting. Where does its power come from? Because it's not just financial. And we're seeing lots of really, really interesting thinking within the climate movement about how to counter this power, and that's really exciting. But of course, ultimately, we do need numbers.
Yeah, well, and what XR's been trying to do very intentionally is recognise there's a big wave of non-cooperation sweeping through our society, right? Whether that's people who are striking on work, whether that's people who are striking paying their bills, whether that's people who are occupying space, going on marches, joining groups, and obviously the climate movement and people engaging in kind of civil resistance tactics like Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain. So knowing that there is this kind of increased appetite for action that you would term non-cooperative in a kind of resistance move towards power, knowing that these things are deeply connected, the cost of living crisis, the price of your energy is very much connected to the climate crisis, and a lot of the actors involved and the people who are profiting are the same and they're connected. Tying all of that together, it does feel to me like we're, with the level of knowledge in this country about climate, which is far higher than most other places in the world, an appetite for action, which is far higher than most places in the world, and a growing energy around resistance and forms of non-compliance and non-cooperation throughout society in terms of a peaceful mode of resistance. It's a very ripe circumstance right now with a totally illegitimate government who's been found to be so blatantly corrupt on so many fronts, to have this coming together around a different way of organising politics, getting ordinary people a seat at the table. And I think that begins with knitting our movements together so that people can understand their common interests. So I hope lots of people will come and join us in April and ongoing for the rest of this year when we carry on bringing out, hopefully, bigger numbers than we ever have before. And I will see you and everyone else on the streets.
I'll be proud to be there with you.